So please pay attention to Coralie Chevalier next.
So I'm going to tell you about autistic spectrum disorders, theory of mind, and the ability to see others as partners. I'm going to start by the initial description that was given by Kanner, and here's what he writes. When taken into a room, we completely disregarded the people and instantly went for objects. When a hand was held out to him so that he could not possibly ignore it, he played with it briefly as if it were a detached object. He did not respond to being called and did not look at his mother when she spoke to him. So that sort of descriptions has been used by people like Baron Cohen to say that, look, autistic people are seeing others not as minds and people, but as objects. And so there's a lot of evidence in favor of this idea that autistic people have a deficit in theory of mind, and the first piece of data was a study that used the false belief task and that demonstrated 20 years ago that a majority of typically developing children and a majority of Down syndrome children passed the false belief task, when only 20% of autistic children did. And that was an important result because the theory of mind appeared both as being universal because it concerned the great majority of children, and as being specific because it was affecting autistic children and not Down syndrome children. So this gave rise to what I call a standard explicative model of autism, whereby the theory of mind deficit would cause issues in social development, issues in communication, and issues in pretend abilities. If you explain all this in autism, you have a pretty good model of autism. So it's quite a powerful model. On top of that, it's giving an explanation as to why there's a presumably lack of empathy in autism, and as to why there's imitation issues. And those two last things would in turn reinforce the problems in social development. So what I'm going to do today is that I'm going to try and say that the ToM deficit is actually not that uncontroversial. I'm also going to try and provide evidence that there's no lack of empathy. And there's evidence that I won't talk about that the imitation issues are not that big in autism, and both of you have mentioned it. So if you remember what I said about the theory of mind business, is that the power of the model is that it implies that the theory of mind deficit is specific and universal. About specificity, it's not that clear because we find theory of mind deficits in lots of other pathologies, including schizophrenia, deafness, and global mental delay. And as far as universality is concerned, it's been noted that autistic children who've got a verbal mental age above 10 systematically pass standard false belief tasks. There's no exception. There's no way you can find an autistic child with a verbal mental age above 10 that will fail a theory of mind task. So this has led researchers, so that's a problem for the standard model. So it's led researchers to question the link between the ability to pass false belief tasks and the ability to do proper mind reading. And indeed, it's true that what could happen when you test an older autistic child with those standard false belief tasks is that you're testing whether they're able to use a compensatory strategy based on explicit verbal reasoning. So you're testing mind reading plus compensatory strategies. And the reason for that is that we've seen that performances in false belief tasks correlate very highly with verbal mental age. And also they drop when we use tasks that are more subtle, they be more difficult. So one way to save the standard model is to say, well, look, there's this subtle ToM deficit in autism. And this subtle ToM deficit, as evidenced by those subtle theory of mind tasks, could be at the core of the persisting social deficit. So I'm going to criticize those ToM tasks on two grounds. The first one is that the results are not always replicated. In tasks that are using the very same material as Baron Cohen, and in original tasks, so I've been the victim of trying to replicate those results, but I won't give you the details. And also, it's not really clear what those subtle tasks are testing. Indeed, they do not rely on meta-representational mechanisms that truly differ from the ones that are involved in false belief tasks. So for example, if you're asked to recognize irony, what you should need is 2 levels of meta-representational abilities. And it's the same in false belief tasks. So what's missing for those children who fail irony tasks and who succeed false belief tasks? So what I want to argue on the basis of the first point is that there is at least a subgroup of autistic people who are truly able to identify a wide range of mental states. So there's at least a subgroup of autistic people who do some proper mind reading. They're not just hacking out a solution to the problem, they're truly mind reading. So this raises an issue, and the issue is the following. How can we explain the persistence of the social problems within this group of autistic people who are capable of proper mind reading? That's the question I'm going to try to answer. And the claim that I want to put forward is that the reason those social deficits persist is that they constitute the very heart of the autistic symptomatology. So they constitute the primary deficit in autism. What do I mean by social deficit? I mean that autistic people lack interest in others. They fail to see others as potential partners. They fail to see the interest we have in putting special effort in social relationships. They lack motivation to please others, to collaborate with them. It's as if they didn't see that collaborating has an interest just for the sake of it. So in other words, I want to argue that they have a deficit in the natural disposition we have to enter relationships. So what does this disposition bring in an evolutionary perspective? Well, of course, non-human animals have social relationships to a certain extent. For example, they can enter competition situations, they can look for a sexual partner, they can take care of their family, etc. But the difference with human beings is that we belong to a highly social species. And thanks to this disposition we have for relationships, we can collaborate with other individuals that are not only our family, and in a way that's mutually advantageous. So it means that not only do we enter competition situations, but we also collaborate and cooperate with people. So this model makes positive predictions. It predicts that autistic individuals will have no special issues in competition, in the desire, they will have the same desire to find a sexual partner, and they will feel empathy and attachment. So that's a point where the two models differ. It also makes negative predictions. It predicts that autistic people will have issues in seeing others as partners, and that has a direct consequence, which is that they're going to take less pleasure in situations of cooperation and interaction, and has an indirect consequence, which is that they're going to be relatively not interested to preserve their reputation. And indeed, and this has been talked about a lot, so I'm going to go quickly through that, the very reason why we care about the way we appear in front of others is that we want to signal that we're good partners for interaction. So if you're not interested in relationships, then you have less of an interest or motivation to show that you're a good person. So let's see if the positive predictions are met. I'm going to present you with experimental evidence together with autobiographical reports and things like that, because I think that both evidence need to be taken seriously. So here's what Hughes writes about his autistic son Walker. He writes, he can't converse, play a game, sit still, tie his shoes. He does every mainline autistic behavior in the book, waves his hands and stares at reflected light, shouts certain words and phrases over and over, rewinds his audio tapes until they break. But there is one quality he has in such abundance that it seems almost to define him, empathy. Here's what Temple Grandin is writing. She's written a whole book about how she cares about animal and how animal sufferings make her suffer. So the book, I could read the whole book for empathy evidence. And here's what she writes. I did not like some of the very cruel experiments they did with mice, rats and monkeys. I remember one poor little monkey that had a little plexiglass thing shoved onto his scrotum that they were shocking him with. I thought that was terrible. Okay, so that's just anecdotal evidence, but there's experimental evidence. Namely that if you ask in questionnaires, how do you feel in such a situation, there's going to be no difference on those empathy scales between autistic people and normal people. So one could say, well, maybe they've learned as a norm almost that when you kill an elephant, you should feel sorry for the elephant. But Blair has measured physiological cues in response to signs of distress, and he found also that there was no difference. They're also attached to family members, and some people have really thought that this was a surprising fact when it's not. And so, for example, if you separate an autistic child from his mom, he's going to feel distressed, and if you put him back with his mom, he's going to feel happy again, just like normal children. About competition, I haven't found much in the literature, but from my interactions with autistic children, I can tell you that when you make an experiment with them, they're really interested in their scores, and not only to know whether they should feel proud of themselves, but they want to know their score in relation to the others. So they want to know if they were the fastest, if they were the best in relation to the others. About the desire to find a sexual partner, we find that there's the same desire to enter an intimate relationship and the same sort of sexual fantasms in autism. I'm not saying that having a love relationship with an Asperger person is something easy, so there's going to be problems, and there's autobiographies written by women married with Asperger people, and they say it's really hard. But I want to stress that in this love relationship, what causes the problem is the relationship, not the love bit is fine, it's the relationship that causes the problem. So, let's see, and that's maybe more interesting, whether the negative predictions are met. So if you remember, there's two negative predictions. One is that they will take less pleasure in interaction, and one is that they will not care about their reputation. So that's a quote from a blog of an autistic adult who writes about, he's trying to defend neurodiversity and saying that being autistic is great and stuff like that. So he writes, "Phil, that's a good point, and I also think that one of the reasons why autistics sometimes have trouble with social situations is that we understand other people's minds all too well." So he's saying we don't have a theory of mind deficit. We might assume, for instance, that because our friends at college all enjoy a big noisy party with lots of beer, we should enjoy it too, and then we can't figure out what went wrong when we don't. So he's saying, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I just don't take any pleasure in drinking beer with people. So what I'm going to try to be doing in this part is to show that it's really not a matter of what they're able to do and not able to do. It's a matter of what they want to pay attention to and what they spontaneously do. So here is, and Geiger has talked about this, so I can go quickly. For instance, young autistic children do not follow the gaze spontaneously, but if you ask them to, they're perfectly able to follow the gaze. This is a very nice experiment where they contrasted two conditions. One where the direction of the gaze predicts the position of a target, and one condition where the position of the gaze doesn't predict the position of the target. In both conditions, typically developing children follow the gaze just because it's interesting. Whereas autistic children only follow the gaze when it carries some relevant information. So this shows that rather than talking about an inability, we should talk about a lack of interest or an absence of spontaneous motivation to do that. The same sort of things can be said for the way they pay attention to faces, and because they don't pay that much attention to faces, some people have found that recognition and memory for faces is impaired in autism. But of course we don't want to say that they cannot recognize faces or that they cannot memorize faces. Also, if you present an autistic person with a social scene and measure the scan paths, you're going to see that they look at different things from us. So we tend to focus on people and they tend to focus on objects. But again, we don't want to say that they're not able to look at people. Of course they're able to look at people. They just prefer to look at objects. And this is my favorite body of research. You ask people to sort photographs spontaneously, and you have two sorting criteria. One is emotional, for example, happy, angry, and one is not emotional, mustache, no mustache, hat, no hat. And those experiments have shown that individuals with autism often prefer the non-emotional sorting criteria. But if you ask them to sort according to the emotional criteria, they're perfectly able to. And if you make it relevant to sort for the emotional criteria, the difference disappears. So if you say, put together the people who are more likely to give you a sweet at the end, of course they're going to put all the happy people in one bunch and all the unhappy people in another bunch. So again, it's more indicative not of an inability, but of something else. The same sort of arguments can be made for sounds and noises. We naturally pay attention to human voices, and this has been presented in Geiger's talk, for example. And this is a very nice ecological study where they provided children with a toy that could, if you pressed one button, it would make noises, and if you press the other button, it's someone speaking. And autistic children are just as attracted by the two buttons of the toy, whereas normal children tend to prefer the speech sound. There's also evidence from imaging studies that shows that perception is fine, but it's the orientation of attention to sounds that's not fine. And more specifically, it's the involuntary attention towards speech sounds that's most impaired in autism. The conclusion of Cipollone et al. Is that autistic people can perceive, but they do not attend. And that's a very good conclusion, I think. So of course this is going to have an influence on the way you make friends. If you're not interested in people, it's hard to make friends. And there's indeed reports and questionnaires that indicate that people with autism have less friends, they initiate peer interaction less often. Half the population with high-functioning autism has no friend with whom they share an activity. So what we mean by having a friend here is not someone with whom you play tennis and that's it. It's someone with whom you do a variety of things and not just your own little thing. However, they feel more lonely. So when I saw that, I thought, oh, that's a problem. But their reports of loneliness do not correlate to the quality of their friendships. So if a control, a typically developing person says, I'm feeling lonely, it's going to correlate with how central they are in the social network and with truly how many friends they have, but not for autistic people. About joint activities, there's a very poor literature. There's a very nice study that was done by Thomas Heller's group, and that's in press now, where they showed that using Felix's task of cooperation, that fewer children in the autism group passed the task involving joint activities with shared goals. And also, if the experimenter went away, there were less attempts from the child to re-engage the experimenter in the game. So that's for interaction. Now let's talk about reputation. So the way we try to preserve our reputation is by being polite, being nice, being helpful, things like that. This is a quote from a woman who's written a book. She's a parent of an Asperger child, and she wrote a book for other parents like her with tips. And she writes, like very young children, people with AS don't play the social game as the rest of us. Many of these games are designed to help us hide bits of ourselves, so it's no wonder that interacting with AS people can make us feel uncomfortable. So why do you feel uncomfortable? This is not very politically correct, but it's true. You feel uncomfortable because they're less polite. It's not working. Oh, yes. So for instance, Hobson has shown that they display less verbal and non-verbal signs of greeting and farewell. And this woman, again, has a whole chapter dedicated to politeness in her book, which is informative. She writes, often, and she seems to be giving up. So on lots of issues, she says, here is how you can fix the problem. And on politeness, she gives up. She says, often the rude behavior of a child with AS is really just honest behavior. Honesty and directness are very much part of Asperger. And even if we could, we don't want to stop our children being who they are. About reputation, there's no experimental work that's dealing directly with the desire to preserve one's reputation in autism. But there's some anecdotal evidence. For instance, they're absolutely not interested in fashion, and they do not take care of how they brush their hair, whether their hands are clean, things like that. And they make absolutely no effort to please others. Well, I'm being a bit insistent. They tend to make less effort to please others. Here's the mom again. She writes, it can be very infuriating when a child seems to have no motivation or interest in conforming or doing a single thing you want him to do. But unfortunately, this is a very common problem with AS children. Most children are naturally motivated, that's really naturally motivated by the desire to please people in authority, or at least keep on the right side of them. But children with AS are often not that interested in pleasing. So there's a need to find experimental work or to design experimental work to confirm this. But when you read autobiographies and books written by siblings, parents, teachers, this is a very common sort of thing. That's a book that was recently published teaching Asperger people to take care of themselves. The very existence of the book goes in the direction of what I'm saying. And I really like the way they teach Asperger kids to go to the toilet. They say, everyone who comes in the bathroom can see me when I use the urinal. I don't drop my pants and underpants when I use the urinal. When I use the urinal, I must only unzip my pants and open the fly of my underwear to pee. I only let my pants drop a little bit. I don't want anyone to see my butt. And it's not about perspective taking. Those kids are Asperger, they're highly clever. If you ask them, if you're in the bathroom and someone comes behind you and you have your pants down, will he see your butt? Of course they can tell you, cognitively they can tell you that the person can see their butt, they just don't care. So my tentative conclusion is the following. I want to argue that there is a possibility that for at least some high-functioning people with autism, the theory of mind module is intact. The social deficits, and in particular the capacity to see others as partners for interaction, would then constitute the very heart of the autistic symptomatology. To conclude, I would like to present you with the initial description that I used at the beginning. And now I read it differently, not in the light of a theory of mind deficit, but in the light of an inability to see others as people and partners for interaction. And I think you can have this double reading. And thank you.
Maybe it's a general question. The prime facie, there seems to be a tension between lack of interest, lack of concern for others, and empathy. I mean, kind of normally functioning empathy. Or no? I mean, why? I mean, how do you reconcile that then?
Well, I mean, rats have empathy, and they're clearly not interested in other rats as partners for interaction. So I see empathy as something that's really low level, and that does not involve that you see others as partners for interaction. But maybe it's a bit clumsy to say lack of interest, so we should really rephrase that.
You're making it seem that you constantly contrasted sort of a competence deficit model with an interest model. But it could be that there is a competence needed to enter into interactions with people.
Oh yes, that's what I believe. I believe that there's this natural disposition to enter relationships and to see the point of being in a relationship. So I don't know if it's a relationship faculty or module, but there is something that's, because we're a species that's interested in sharing actions, this competence is likely to be associated with evolving the ability to share actions. So I believe that there is a deficit somewhere. I'm not saying that they're all fine. I'm just arguing that it's not necessarily a theory of mind deficit.
So, a specific question. In the experiments about gaze following, where the point isn't just knowing where the person is looking or choosing to follow, but understanding what's being communicated, like the word word learning experiments, where you wait till the child is looking at something that's novel, then you look into the bucket and say, look, lick it, and the autistic child doesn't figure out that lick it isn't what you're referring to. When that's in between a theory of mind deficit and I guess the question is, what's the relation between the social deficit that you're imagining and the pedagogical stance, which is a particular, it goes beyond mere theory of mind, but this seems to be an example of using communication for the purpose of not being in a relation, but something that depends upon being in a relation.
Well, I'm having a hard time finding the right word for this thing. So I called it relation, but maybe a better way of what I want to say is that not only do they have problems in relations, but the reason why they have problems in relations is that they do not see others as partners and they do not see others as resources So if you don't see the other person in front of you as a potential person who can provide you with information, you're less likely to be sensitive to pedagogy or to ostensive communicative cues. Does that make sense?
But perhaps that's the problem. That's the deficit itself. We talked about it, so it could be just, the basis could be communicating deficits. If you don't understand how human communication, which is inherently cooperative, works, right, then you would not be able to do anything, even if you are perfectly capable of discriminating non-static stimulus or not non-static stimulus. If it doesn't mean you anything, non-static stimulus, you are not. And so some of the studies that you cited here, for example, not interested in speech, more likely to suggest a communicative problem in the generally cooperation problem. Of course, you can say it's difficult to take it apart. Or think about the other study, like the Hobson study. Probably George can tell you better how it goes when they do these stickers that we can you?
No. The sticker game is that you either you have a sticker and the autistic child has a sticker, and then you tell the child that, put your sticker here. So you use your own body to instruct him where on his body you should put the sticker. Or you give to the child. The child is supposed to tell you now where you should put your sticker. There's kind of an interesting asymmetry of finding that the autistic child is not using his own body to inform you about it. But they can actually understand your self-referential pointing as kind of referentially related to their own body. It's really funny, it looks as if they would think nobody else has a theory of mind, only them.
It again suggests the pragmatic problems.
I'm not denying that there's a pragmatic problem, not at all. But it's really hard to disentangle cooperation and communication, because communication is probably the cooperative activity. So of course if you have a problem in cooperation, you're going to communicate less efficiently. So I agree that it could go both ways, and I think it's going to be really hard to find a test case for what you say or for what I say to really try to see the causal relationship. I really want to insist on the fact that because they're not interested in speech doesn't mean that it's a communicative problem. Because the fact is that the truth is that if you speak to an autistic person, they can answer you, they can understand you, they can even make jokes. Right. Some of them can even understand irony. So, but then why don't they spontaneously? So, but it's really hard. I mean, I've got no real answer.
You could create situations where there is communication, but it's not cooperation. So, for example, when something is for their own sake, so for example, in your task with emotion, and they have to use emotion because it's relevant for their own interest. So then they're not cooperating with you, but they could use your communication for their own purposes.
Yeah. That's a good point. I would predict that they would succeed in this one.
They would pass it?
Yeah.
Let's
try.
So we all, well, many of us anyway, suffer from being overly enamored of our own methods. But it seems to me that experimental economic games offer an opportunity to test this. So I mentioned that there's debate about what those iSpot results mean in the dictator game. Some people claiming it's an empathy effect. It seems to me that if you have people play dictator games, and in one condition you frame player 2 as somebody in need, and in the other condition you provide information about player 2 indicating that this is a valuable potential coalition partner. This person's smart and hardworking and all these kinds of things that people look for in coalition partners. That, I mean, your hypothesis makes clear divergent predictions that the people with autism should respond at least akin to, perhaps there's a difference in degree, normals with regard to information about need because they feel empathy, right? But they shouldn't respond to information about the value of the other as a potential coalition partner. So their offers should be no different than baseline.
That was the plan, actually.
Sorry?
it was my plan to use some of your stuff.
Ah, well,
with
then I think
autistic
it's a
people.
brilliant plan.
Yeah, I have a question about finding that they can compete and even care about their score in relation to others.
Well, it's not a finding, it's my impression from working with them. So
Okay, but that would be critical, I think, because it seems to me like if they do that, and assuming that they do that, and they do not care about a reputation, I don't know, because it seems to me like that's a very crucial step.
well, it's a really interesting piece of information to know if you're the strongest in your group, regardless of whether you care if you've got if your hair is presentable and things like that. So I have the feeling that it's quite different, just because animals are interested in competition situation and they want to be strongest, and they're going to monitor the attitude of other animals to make sure that they're the biggest guys. So it's no surprise that they should be interested in that as well. I mean, I'm not saying they're chimps, but you see my point.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's the same, but still it would be interesting to see what exactly are the differences here and what the competencies are that, if this discrepancy exists, are the ones that make it. And it could be something else than what you propose, because like in competition, it's just maybe more salient if you have a scale and you say points are assigned, etc., than in these more complex social situations where you have to understand certain norms that are often also conflicting, etc. So yeah.
Yes, I'm sure that there's going to be lots of cases where competition is fed by your envy to look nice in the eyes of others. So, but there's going to be some cases at least where competition is completely isolated and not affected by the desire to preserve your reputation. And in those cases, they should be okay. And in the cases where there's both, they should be slightly impaired. So, for example, you could say, well, fashion is a bit like that. In fashion, you try to enter a competition and you want to be the most fashionable person. And here, there's the two things that go together in the same direction of making you want to be fashionable. But I'm talking about true competition situations. If you have them play a game, they're going to understand that the purpose is to win, and they will be interested in winning. That's all I'm saying. But again, I've got no evidence.
Yes.
I don't know if you looked at very early evidence from language learning, but they had autistic children have a problem in the phase of language learning, which is pre-verbal, just the joint attention and looking at the same thing with the mother, and then that they were, at that point, they were already unable to do this. So they wouldn't identify the same object, and as a consequence, later communicative skills and language learning was delayed. So it's very early, I don't know, 8 months or something.
Yes, well, I think that this natural disposition is something that's there from the beginning. And it's this natural disposition to make you look at others that will direct the child's attention towards people rather than lamps and tables. So it's not saying that the language deficit is there very early and that there's early signs of the fact that they don't pay attention to others is not incompatible with what I'm saying. It doesn't differentiate the theory of mind deficits and what I'm saying, but it's not incompatible.
Can I bring in one other idea and problem about autism that maps onto your kind of target, but it also explains another aspect that is not captured by your approach. And the other aspect is central. The symptom is the repetitive stereotypic movement and the like love of invariance, that kind of stuff. And the theory of mind deficit doesn't have much to say about that either. There is a theory, John Watson's theory, speculation about autism, which is that infants are there is an innate contingency detection device that is computing the degree of causal control that your behavior has over certain aspects of the stimulus environment over repeated trials. And this is, there is evidence at the beginning of life, like first 3 months, infants are driven are preferentially seeking out perfect contingency. The idea is that the function of that is to kind of map out your own body image, because but perfectly response contingent is produced by your own body. But if you would stay like that, it would kind of be very dysfunctional, because self-simulation would always win out over lower than perfect contingencies, which are indeed, but social contingencies are there. You have in communication and relationship, you have a kind of medium-high control over the other's behavior, but not a perfect control. That's, in terms of contingency, that's what social target, the obscure object of social desire is. Cool, the title of the paper we written, but at any rate, the point, the interesting thing is that in normal development there seems to be an active inhibition established around 3 months on the kind of seeking out the perfect end of the contingency relations, which make kind of high but imperfect social contingencies more, attracting than self-simulation. And the idea is that this genetically controlled switch that is kind of speculated about by John Watson is not established in autistic children, so they remain perfect contingency seekers, and social contingencies are just not engaging enough for them as it is to all others, and therefore all these consequences that you are describing in terms of interest in relationships would follow. But one other thing that would follow is the investment in generating perfect contingencies by the repetitive behaviors and by the invariance seeking. It would give you kind of the input problem that leads you to the relationship, lack of interest in social relationships.
But that's, okay, there's several things. First, I'm not claiming that this is true. I'm not claiming that this is the explanation that's going to explain the whole symptomatology of autism. Second, I do not think that there is such an explanation, and I think that there's good genetic evidence that goes in the direction of, and Francesca Happy would say, it's time to give up on this dream of a single explanation, because there's no such single explanation. It's a complex disorder with lots of different manifestations. So all the theories could be compatible and could explain different manifestations of the syndrome. And so a lot of autistic children do not have stereotypies. And it's one way of seeing it. It's a spectrum with lots of different manifestations, so there are going to be lots of different explanations. And the last point is that I didn't have enough time, but I have a story to tell as to why they have strengths as well as deficits from this framework. But maybe I could give a second talk.
Jan, you had something?
I was just going to point out, sorry, that I mean, there are, I'm sympathetic to this, it's a spectrum and not a thing argument, that there can be details of problems along the way, and this is, I think, akin to this question of contingent coordination. So, for example, as I mentioned earlier, direct gaze is a threat display in all primates and humans included. Now, we have overwritten that program with a certain meaning of direct gaze in communication, and I'm now convinced in pedagogy in particular, right? But if you're less interested in communication, because communication is largely about establishing cooperative relationships, for example, right? Then the ancestral version of the trait is going to loom much larger. And so, you find it aversive to be stared at, right, as it were, whereas other people see that as making a connection, because other people are interested in the coalition formation and you're not.
That's a really good point, thanks.
I think we have time for a coffee break now.